Cleopatra's looks and general appearance tend to get a lot of attention. There's been a controversy recently about a documentary and the depiction of her there. Can't say I've seen the documentary, didn't have anything to do with it, but what I thought might be interesting is simply to go to the ancient sources and present a summary of the evidence we have for what Cleopatra looked like. But to cut a long story short, and if you don't want to watch the rest of the video, the essential answer is, well, we don't really know. But we have some hints, we can guess, but it really doesn't go much beyond that. So let's begin with official portraits from her lifetime. Now these are really of two types where we know unequivocally that it's her. These are monuments in the traditional Egyptian style, most notably on the wall of one of the great temples that shows her and Caesarion, but it depicts them in that very formal, well-established tradition. That means that we can't really say whether or not this looked anything like the real individual. They are there fulfilling their roles as pharaohs, rather than as an advert for saying, well, this is the individual idiosyncrasies of Cleopatra and her son. The other thing where we're sure it's supposed to be her is the coinage. And there are several issues from different periods in her life, some beginning quite early from coins, for instance, from Ascalon, in one of the old Philistine cities of the Old Testament period. That shows her when she's in her late teens, 20-ish, that sort of time. Now, you can tell it's Cleopatra, as with all these coins, because she's depicted with a diadem, a band around her head, and her hair is fastened back into a bun. This is the Hellenistic Greek style for monarchs, for queens, for royalty. So, again, while you could say, well, from some of the temple portraits, you've got something rather like the Elizabeth Taylor ornate headdress and very sort of over-the-top Egyptian look, that's not how she's presented on a coin for the audience for which the coin's intended. But again, we have to remember this. These coins are very, very small. They are quite detailed, but they are not intended, again, as a photographically accurate representation of the person in question. They are a statement of power, of authority, of right to rule. Now in these, Cleopatra is depicted with her hairstyle. She's depicted with quite large eyes and a nose that tends to hook down a little bit, or sometimes more. Some of her later portraits she's depicted as quite bulky, quite big, but again, the early portraits are very much stressing that she's a Ptolemy. Now, the Ptolemies were this dynasty established by one of the commanders of Alexander the Great, who in the confusion after Alexander's death seizes control in Egypt and eventually declares himself king, creates a kingdom based around Egypt. It was never meant exclusively to be Egypt because it also had Crete and he had ambitions for Palestine, Syria, beyond even Greece itself. Particularly in the early days, probably all of the successor monarchs had at least in the back of their mind a dream that they could recover all or most of Alexander's empire. And bear in mind that Alexandria, which is founded and set up by Alexander the Great, is really developed under the Ptolemies. It is developed as a new Athens, as a centre of Hellenic learning. The great library there will produce all these books, collect all these books, including, for instance, translations of Jewish scriptures into Greek. The emphasis is very much on what can we as Greeks understand from the knowledge of the wider world, rather than a meeting of equals between different intellectual traditions. Now, the first Ptolemy, by the look of things, seems to have had quite big eyes and a rather hooked nose and pointed chin. To emphasize their legitimacy, there is a Ptolemy look that king after king, queen after queen put on their coins. And Cleopatra is part of that tradition. So in these coins, she's making abundantly clear, I'm a Ptolemy, I should be queen, I should be ruling, I'm part of the family. And that's the important message, rather than, this is what I look like. And if you saw me in the street, this is how you know who I am. So these are symbols of power, symbols of legitimacy within the family. And bear in mind the context of this. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy Auletes, has been chased out by a conspiracy led by, or at least with Cleopatra's older sister as a figurehead. And he's returned with the help of Roman troops, and the sister's been executed. He's been restored as king. Cleopatra has started to rule alongside him in the last years of his reign. She's now co-ruler with a brother. and there are different factions in the court working out, well, what's to our advantage, which one do we really want to be in charge, have the most authority. So she is a Ptolemy, and to be a Ptolemy means you're living a very dangerous life where there's a fair chance that your own family or people supporting different members of your own family will want to kill you. And you just look at, Cleopatra's, the brother with whom she rules first, dies in the aftermath of the war fought partly by Julius Caesar on Cleopatra's behalf. Her other remaining brother dies mysteriously, and most people suspect her of having poisoned him. Arsinoe, her remaining sister, is eventually executed by Mark Antony on Cleopatra's orders, or at least Cleopatra has persuaded Mark Antony to do this. So you can tell just how dangerous it is to be a Ptolemy. So the coins, the temple portraits, don't really give us much idea beyond a very general sense of how the person looked. Beyond that, there are other images that have been identified with more or less confidence as Cleopatra. And for instance, there's a bust in the collection at Berlin, and you've got the headband, the diadem, and you've got the hair gathered back into a bun. There are others. There's a wall painting from Italy that, again, shows the diadem, shows the bun. Is it Cleopatra? Is it one of Cleopatra's descendants, daughter, granddaughter? Is it another Hellenistic queen or monarch? Or is it, even some mythological figure, divine figure? We can't be sure. There's nowhere where somebody says, and there's a nice inscription beneath to say, this is Cleopatra. This is what she looked like. So even if the artists who made those things did know what Cleopatra really looked like, either they'd seen her, it was taken from life, or they were copying something that had been taken from life, we can't be sure that any of these things are, with 100% certainty, Cleopatra. And even within that, apart from the wall painting, obviously there's no hint of complexion, of colour of hair, of eyes, of this sort of thing. So we don't get very far with the physical representations that are left in art of one form or another. So we can guess, we can judge, but one thing always to bear in mind, and this was true in antiquity, particularly late antiquity, and then true again in the Renaissance and in more modern periods. If you had a bust or a statue of someone in your collection, you'd prefer it to be of somebody famous. So many of the identifications of portraits of prominent Romans, Greeks, the like, might not be true. They might well be simply have a long tradition of someone saying, well, I rather wish this was a famous philosopher or this was a famous Roman general. So we can't be sure. We've got to be cautious all the time with this sort of thing. So then we move on to the literary evidence, and this, of course, is much vaguer. On the whole, our sources don't talk about what Cleopatra looked like much at all. It doesn't really seem to have concerned them. We have a few brief comments, and that's about it. The two key ones, then the first is often misunderstood, are from Plutarch and from Dio. Now, Plutarch was writing early part of the 2nd century AD, so that's well over a century, 130 years or so after Cleopatra has killed herself. So obviously he never saw her, but he may have seen good paintings and other images of her that were taken from life. Though again, when these are commissioned, what's the purpose of it? Is it necessarily all about getting 100% accuracy? This is what this person looked like. Dio wrote even later in the 3rd century AD. So although again he's dealing with earlier sources, many of them now lost to us, nevertheless we don't know how accurate the information was. Now, Plutarch commented that in itself her beauty was not absolutely without parallel, not the kind to astonish those who saw her, but her presence exerted an inevitable fascination. And he talks about her conversation, her charisma. Now, a lot of people rather misinterpret that passage and say, well, that means he didn't think she was beautiful. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that the really attractive, the really incredible, the really mesmerizing thing about her was the personality, the voice, and the liveliness, the wit behind it all. He doesn't say this person is unattractive physically. That's not what he's saying at all, just that wasn't the really big thing. The big thing when you were in her presence was that she just stunned people because of who she was. There was some magic about her that made you pay attention, that made you want to be liked, want to, want her approval, that sort of thing, that she could fascinate you. And some of it was deliberate. She was good at conversation. She'd change her style of humor. So he talks about how she sort of dropped a level or two for Mark Antony because he liked rather cruder humor, rather less subtle than, say, somebody like Julius Caesar. So she adapted. Someone who's clever, someone who knows how to work people. So it's all about that. It's about personality as well as looks. Whereas Dyer was more specific and talked about Cleopatra as a woman of surpassing beauty, particularly when she was young, and also, but again, goes on to her voice. Very charming, and her intelligence, her knowledge, her learning. This was someone who could make herself very, very appealing, very, very attractive, very mesmerizing. And I think the best way to think of this is to think of star quality today amongst famous actors and actresses. The ones who become really, really famous aren't necessarily the most perfectly beautiful or handsome people in the world. Their faces might not be purely symmetrical to all the ideals of good looks and beauty, however much those change, whatever they happen to be at the time. But they tend to have that physical attractiveness, but they add something to it. The camera loves them. They have a way of moving, of looking, of standing that just draws our attention. And you meet some people like this, that they can stand out in a room in a big crowd. For some reason, the rest of us notice them. Now, Cleopatra clearly had that sort of star quality in abundance. And she had intelligence, she had political acumen, but she had a knack for reading people. She's good at working a crowd. She's good at working individuals. And it's a mixture, as again with so many people, probably some of it is deliberate, some of it is carefully studied and prepared, some of it is just something they're good at doing. Now, bear in mind as well, this doesn't really leap out to us from any of the physical images, the busts, or let alone the coins or anything like that. But then it's very hard to capture. People will talk about the mesmerizing power of Napoleon's personality, but you don't really see it in any of the paintings done from life. And the same when you see black and white photographs of various statesmen and leaders and people, actors who appeared on stage. You can't see why he or she had this incredible effect on everybody else. It just doesn't necessarily come across in these rather rigid, because that would require an even greater level of genius to capture. So I think you can safely say that by most standards, even including Dyer's account, Cleopatra was considered to be attractive, and some people thought she was really beautiful. But of course, what do those terms mean? Anything like that is highly subjective, and to add to the personality that is making her seem more wonderful, more attractive to everyone, there's the glamour of being a queen. Royalty, fame, all of these things matter. And they matter today, and they've always mattered to human beings. We get won over by this, particularly by those who have the looks, the charm, the intelligence, the wit that she clearly had. But they don't really tell us anything very much other than she was attractive, she was probably beautiful or fairly beautiful, if not necessarily the most beautiful woman in the world. She's not a Helen of Troy, where at least in some of the stories, the big thing about her is the fact that she's really beautiful rather than anything else. With Cleopatra, there are other things that make her important. And whatever her physical looks, the charm, the animation, the personality were what tended to capture people, particularly those she set out to convince. What is very noticeable in this, and is a general pattern of ancient literature in general, is that they don't really talk about the details that we might like to know for some reason. So they don't tell us about what colour hair, what colour eyes, what a complexion was like, any of these things. That does not concern Plutarch or Dio. They don't feel fit to tell us. They don't think that there's much point in telling you that. Now, either that's because they assume these things simply aren't important, or that in their day there were enough representations of Cleopatra still around that if people wanted to know those sort of details, they could go and look at a portrait, they could go and look at a painted statue or something like that. But more probably, it's simply they are not concerned about this. With many individuals, prominent, famous people from the ancient world, we're not told these things. It's quite rare to be told the colour even of someone's eyes. And usually it's only if they were considered particularly dark and mesmerising or unusual. in some way. That later tradition that Alexander had one eye that was a half and half colouring, that again is not in any of the truly classical sources, comes much later. Does it preserve a real memory, or is it some invention later on because you feel someone as successful, as different as this ought to be distinguished in other ways? So the only mention really of anything to do with Cleopatra's complexion or colouring comes from the poet Lucan. Now, he's writing in Nero's day in the 1st century AD, so this is nearly a century after Cleopatra's death. And he conjures up this very exotic image of Caesar feasting with Cleopatra in the court there in Egypt, and Cleopatra is dressed in this shimmering, almost transparent silk dress that shows off her candida pectora, her white chest, her white breasts. That's it. He talks about the complexions of various slaves in her court and presents this view of a sort of exotic mixture of people, of pretty women from all over the world, to make this more decadent, more exotic, more over-the-top luxurious, in a way that probably many of the aristocrats in Nero's Rome were living as well. But it's part of that. So this is a poet writing a poem about the Civil War with a particular agenda, but certainly he's not someone who is emphasizing strict historical facts. So it might be that candida pectora, white breasts, are simply a sort of standard poetic form of praise for someone who's beautiful. In the same way you could go back to, as far back as the Iliad, all the different epithets applied to gods, goddesses, and various heroes, nymphs, human women, all this sort of thing that will single out some aspect of their appearance, ox-eyed, that sort of thing, golden, these sorts of things. Can we really draw much from that? My suspicion is probably not. With all of these things, you come up against the problem that white compared to what? What does candida really mean? You can translate it when, say, the poet Catullus, who's a contemporary of Cleopatra, talks about a candida puella, a white girl. Is it a blonde girl? Is that what they're talking about? But again, what does that mean? All of these things are subjective. So, for instance, Alexander the Great is described as with fair hair, with tawny hair, leonine, lion-like hair. The only colour portrait of him to survive is from Roman Italy, and that's the famous painting of the Battle of Issus. That's a copy of a much older one that perhaps does go back to Alexander's lifetime or something close to it, where he has hair that's not much lighter than mine. It's brown, it's a sort of darkish, medium coloured brown, but it's not peroxide blonde in the way that whenever we've had a screen representation of Alexander the Great with Richard Burton, or with the more recent Oliver Stone film, this is bright, gleaming peroxide blonde. Now, would, to someone who is used to nearly everybody having black hair or very dark brown hair, would, as far as they're concerned, white or blonde actually mean not that, something a bit lighter? Or would it mean blonde, fair, in the sense that we North Europeans are more used to thinking of that? And the truth is we don't know. So what does this mean? I mean, presumably anyway, because we're talking about breasts, obviously hair is not an issue in this. This is about skin colour. There is that strong tradition in the Greek and Hellenic world, and then more widely the Roman world, that aristocratic women, because to show that they're wealthy, that they are respectable, they keep out of sunlight, therefore they're not tanned by the sun by having to work in the fields, so they are fair, they are light-skinned. And a lot of artistic representations will show them as very white, very pale. So it could again be part of that tradition, if that's what you think of as that particular form of beauty. But it probably doesn't really tell us very much. It's a very slim read on which to base a theory about Cleopatra's complexion in any sort of detail. So we come back finally to the more general of Cleopatra's family. Now this is complicated. We don't really know who Cleopatra's mother was. It may well have been that her parents were brother and sister, but again, different sources can be taken to mean different things. And again, if you want the detail, you can look at this in the book. So maybe, maybe not. In the main, the Ptolemies did practice a lot of incestuous marriage, so quite a lot of her family tree is much narrower than would be normal today and healthy today. The Ptolemies are originally Macedonian Northern Greek, and over the centuries they will marry or have as mistresses, in the main, people from that same Macedonian Greek aristocratic class. There is one Seleucid princess who marries into the Ptolemies early on, who is descended from one of the Persian wives that Alexander the Great gave in his mass wedding ceremony to his commanders and many of his soldiers. Seleucus, the founder of the Seleucid dynasty, was the only one not to divorce that wife after Alexander's death. So you could say there's some Syrian or Persian blood there, though it's not a great deal. Descriptions of Cleopatra's family and the Ptolemies in general aren't any much more detailed than the descriptions of her. Some speak of them as with golden hair and fair hair, some of her ancestors, though again not Cleopatra herself, it's never mentioned in her case, and of them their hair is literally compared to gold, and there's talk of gold dust sprinkled in it and this sort of thing. So that might mean something closer to blonde as we would understand it from a modern perspective, rather than blonde as anything that isn't really, really dark brown or black in terms of hair colour. So difficult to know. There is a fairly wide range. The Macedonians were not an ethnically simple and homogeneous group, and had intermarried, particularly their royal family, with Illyrians, with Thracians, with other tribal peoples from the north, as well as with various Greeks. And we don't altogether know just what all the different groups within Greece looked like, and how much mixture there was, how much variation there was in complexions, in eye colour, in hair colour, all of these things. So essentially you can say that's the bulk of her origins. It is obviously theoretically possible that at some point along this family tree, a child who was not actually the child of both the openly confessed parents succeeds to power, is accepted either consciously or unconsciously because they're considered the right person for the job or they're favoured. But there is no direct evidence for that. So although it is possible that there are children of mistresses from other sources, people we don't know about, we can't say definitely that that happened. So it's speculation. That's a possibility, but no more than a possibility. And even if that has happened, again, the probability would be that these mistresses would most likely be drawn from the same Macedonian, Greek, aristocratic families. Though again, that's probability. We're not dealing with certainties. Just about every stage we come along in looking at Cleopatra, what she looked like, her colouring, her complexion, we're not dealing with certainties, we're dealing with possibilities and probabilities. We're trying to piece together guesswork, essentially, because the sources don't tell us, and there are no representations where we can say absolutely definitely this is her and this is what she really looked like. So there is a range of possibilities. I suppose in a sense, the most likely is that she'd look more chance of looking like someone from Greece, Macedonia today, or the Mediterranean world today than anything else. But that's really guesswork. We don't know. And in the end, comes back to what I said at the start. You can talk a lot about Cleopatra, you can talk a lot about her political importance, what she achieved, what she tried to do, try and understand what she was trying to do, and ultimately explain her failure and her death. But we know more about that. That's what the ancient sources considered important, is what Cleopatra did. What she represented to the Romans, but also what she tried to do on her own account as a monarch of a wealthy but a Hellenistic kingdom, but one that is living in a world that is dominated by the Romans, that no longer has the military might. She can't fight the Romans as an equal, she can't oppose them. She is trying to get the best deal from the Romans, and as part of that, the affairs with two of the most significant Romans and most powerful Romans of that era. So that gives you an idea of her success, and it is no coincidence that we know most about Cleopatra when she's having the affair with Caesar, when she's having the affair with Mark Antony, and much less whenever she's not actually with them. Because that was when she mattered politically to our sources that are dominated by the understanding the Roman Republic is dominating the Mediterranean world. We need to know what's happening there. But just to end, I think there is a significance, and there's probably a lesson to be learned by this interest, almost at times obsession in Cleopatra's appearance, what she looked like, whether or not she was beautiful, what ethnicity she was, because we don't say that about Julius Caesar or Mark Antony, even about Alexander the Great to a fair extent. We're not really that bothered about what they looked like and what colour hair they had. And that might be partly because we think, well, they're just a load of Italians, so that still look like Italian people today, and maybe not. But again, Italian people today vary from region to region. It's more because Cleopatra is who she is, and because she's this rare thing of a woman who is politically significant, but who's also become this, in legend, seductress, this sort of epitome of beauty and perhaps of both positive and negative attributes, that suddenly it becomes important for us to know, what did she look like? So we end up where we started and say that we don't really know what Cleopatra looked like, and we certainly don't have any good idea of her hair colour, eye colour, that sort of thing. We can say more generally her ancestry, her family are Macedonian, Greek, with a few little influences from outside, a little bit of a Syrian connection, Syrian Persian. But beyond that, we don't know, because we don't really know what was normal, what was the range of appearances and complexions within those groupings. We can say this: she was physically attractive, probably beautiful by most standards, and certainly incredibly charismatic. She had intelligence, she had wit, she had a voice that people liked to hear, and she has this naturally, but also develops the capacity to deal with others in the same way that any political leader has to, whether you're a monarch or not. If you want to survive, if you want to succeed, you've got to persuade others, you've got at times to frighten them, to cajole them, to win them over in whatever way you can to achieve what you need to do. And she is very successful at doing this, which means that she's good at it. So we know that about Cleopatra, and we know about her political importance. And as I say, there is something concerning about our obsession with her looks when we don't really care about how anybody else looked in the wider ancient world. And sometimes that distracts from her real political and historical importance. Cleopatra mattered because she was the leader of a wealthy kingdom that is one of the biggest and most significant allies of the Roman Republic. And she existed in a world dominated by that same Roman Republic. She did not have the military capacity to hope to fight the Romans and defeat them on her own. And she doesn't ever try to do that. She is always, throughout her life, an ally of Rome. Cleopatra's fundamental problem was not that she was disloyal to the Romans ever, it's just that the Romans kept tearing themselves apart, and there was so much confusion, so much civil war, different leaders rose and fell in Rome, and for an ally like Cleopatra and many of the others in the wider world, it was extraordinarily difficult to keep track of who was in charge and make sure that you had won the favour of the current big warlord, and then hope that that person or that group stays around for long enough so that all the effort you've put into, all the resources you've put into winning them over actually bear long-term fruit. So Cleopatra's story makes sense and needs to be understood within the political context of this very violent, disturbed period of Mediterranean history caused by the fracturing within the Roman Republic. But we do need to see her primarily as the leader, as the queen, as the monarch, as the ally. And that's the Cleopatra that mattered. That's the one who has an impact on the world, although obviously because she ends up on a losing side with Mark Antony in the Civil War, she becomes a memory of an alternative that never happened and a memory of something different, because she is the last of the Ptolemies to rule in any meaningful sense in the kingdom based around Egypt. And that's the end of 3 centuries or so almost of Ptolemaic rule. That's a major period, though, by the standards of Egypt. That is one of those civilizations that is so incredibly ancient, it's a relatively short period. But nevertheless, Cleopatra becomes something exotic, a memory, and you can tell even, you look at the poet Horace, who's writing about her death and the victory at Actium and the aftermath. From early on, there is hatred, fear, but also admiration. And they're remembering very much the political leader rather than primarily the seductress who all too often takes over in popular culture. And there's no reason at all that shouldn't happen in popular culture, but historians are doing something else. We're not here simply to repeat the stories and take all the assumptions of past generations. We're here to try and understand these people as human beings and understand the world in which they live, the environment in which they operated in. So on that basis, does it really matter what she looked like? I suspect not.